Okay, getting into page 314 of the Reference Guide to Regulatory Compliance about the Truth in Lending Act. Or I believe I just finished page 314, and I'm trying to scroll down. Right, there's a couple more requirements on the Truth in Lending disclosure statement, and that would be just some extra stuff here on negative AM loans. If a lender's making one, they must disclose the interest rate at consummation, and if it will adjust after consummation, the length of time until it can adjust, labeled as the introductory rate, and further disclose the maximum interest rate that could apply when the consumer must begin making fully amortizing payments. And lastly, disclosing if the minimum payment will increase prior to the time fully amortizing payments are required, and the maximum interest rate that could apply at the time of the payment increase, and the date of the increase, and if a second increase could occur before the consumer is required to begin making fully amortizing payments. The same information for the second increase. Introductory rate disclosures for amortizing ARM loans is another item to disclose on the TILA disclosure statement, which is required when the interest rate at consummation is less than the fully indexed rate, and it must be disclosed using the model form for introductory rates. Must disclose the interest rate at consummation and the period in time for which it applies. Must include a statement that even if market rates do not change, the interest rate will increase at the first adjustment and the designation month or year of the rate adjustment. And lastly, must disclose the fully indexed rate. Payment disclosures. For fully amortizing loans, if all periodic payments will be applied to accrued interest and principal disclosed for each interest rate, the corresponding periodic principal and interest payment. If the periodic payment may increase without regard to the interest rate to an interest rate adjustment, the payment that corresponds to the first such increase and the earliest date it could occur. Further, that an escrow account is required if applicable, and an estimate of the taxes and insurance, including mortgage insurance, payable with each periodic payment. And lastly, the total of payments, including principal, interest, and escrowed amounts. And, as I read this in my mind, I kind of picture the disclosure looking like a table and being extrapolated out for the first adjustment and the highest amount that it could be, and another column for, like, say, the last payment. So just try to picture that as I'm reading. Interest-only loan requirements on the disclosure statement would be for the bank to disclose for each interest rate the corresponding payment information as follows, which is 1, if the payment will be applied to interest, label an interest payment and a statement that none is being applied to the principal. 2, if the payment will be applied to accrued interest and principal, the earliest date that the payment will be required, and an itemization of the amount applied to accrued interest, titled interest payment, and the amount applied to principal, titled principal payment, and any escrowed amounts required, and the sum of all amounts required, labeled total estimated monthly payment. Again, for negative AM loans, disclose the following, which involves 1, the minimum periodic payment required until the first payment or interest rate increase. 2, the minimum periodic payment that would be due at the first payment increase and the second, if any. 3, a statement that the minimum payment pays only some interest, does not repay and principal, and will cause the loan amount to increase. 4, the fully amortizing periodic payment amount at the earliest time one must be made. 5, if applicable, the amount of the fully amortizing periodic payment labeled as a full payment option, and a statement that these payments pay all principal and accrued interest. D, balloon payment loans. If the transaction requires a balloon payment, a payment that is more than twice the size of a regular periodic payment, disclose the following. 1, the balloon payment amount separately from the other payment disclosures and outside the table in a manner similar to the model form. And 2, if the balloon payment is scheduled to occur at the same time as another payment, then disclose the balloon payment within the table. E, other disclosures for negatively amortizing loans. These disclosures are required for negatively amortizing loans in close proximity to the table required for such loans. I, the maximum interest rate. 2, the shortest period of time in which the rate could be reached. 3, the amount of estimated taxes and insurance included in each payment. 3, a statement that the loan offers payment options, 2 of which are shown. The dollar amount of the increase in the loan's principal balance if the consumer makes only the minimum required payments for the maximum possible time. And 6, the earliest date on which the consumer must begin making fully amortizing payments, assuming the maximum interest rate is reached at the earliest possible time. Beginning on the top of page 317, there's more requirements for the TILA disclosure statement. For instance, you must disclose if there is no guarantee to refinance for closed-end transactions secured by real property or a dwelling other than a loan secured by a timeshare. The lender must disclose that there is no guarantee the consumer can refinance a transaction to lower the interest rate of periodic payments. As of 10/3/15, loans that are subject to the early disclosure requirements of Reg Z 19E and F are not subject to this disclosure requirement. Other disclosure requirements under 102618 is the identity of the creditor making the disclosure, late payment charges that may be imposed stated as a dollar amount or percentage of the payment. 3, contract reference stating that other information about the responsibilities and obligations of the creditor and borrower may be found in the contract, and if a deposit is required, disclosure stating that the APR does not reflect the effect of the deposit, and fees paid to public officials for determining the existence of, perfecting, and releasing a security interest of the fee. If such fees are to be excluded from if there are such fees, they are to be excluded from the finance charge. Closing disclosure on mortgage loans, which is going to be mandatory as of October 3rd of 2015. The title must be Closing Disclosures. The statement of purpose as follows: that this form is a statement of final loan terms and closing costs. Compare this document with your loan estimate. The closing information to include the date the disclosures are delivered, the date of consummation, the closing date that is, the date the amounts due and from the consumer and the seller are expected to be paid, the name of the settlement agent, the address or location of the property, and in transactions with a seller, the sale price. In transactions with no seller, the appraised value of the property. Transaction information to include is the borrower's name and address, if applicable, the seller's name and address, and the name of the creditor making the disclosures. Loan information to include is the loan term to maturity, the purpose, the type of the product, the type, and the loan identification number. Further, the case number for the mortgage insurance policy, if any. Include the loan term and the purpose, to include the purpose for the loan using one of the following terms: purchase, refi, construction, or home equity loan. Further, the product information as follows: adjustable rate, step rate, or fixed rate. The loan type, including conventional, whether it is FHA, VA, or other. If other is used, a creditor must provide a brief description in the loan type, the loan identification number, the case number for any mortgage insurance policy, a separate table of loan terms including loan amount, interest rate, fully indexed, if and ARM, principal and interest payment, prepayment penalty. If the answer is yes, then the maximum amount of the penalty that can be imposed and the period during which it can be imposed. Balloon payment, if the answer is yes, the maximum amount of the balloon payment and the date. And a table of projected payments with the following information: itemization of each separate periodic payment or range of payments with an estimate of taxes, insurance, and assessments, and the payments to be made from the escrow accounts. 2, if the loan has the following features, the disclosures of separate periodic payments or ranges are required. That's A, the periodic principal and interest payments may change. B, a scheduled balloon payment will occur. C, the creditor must automatically terminate mortgage insurance. D, the anniversary of the due date of the initial periodic payment. Only 3 sets of payments may be disclosed on this table, not counting a balloon payment that is a final payment. Payment changes resulting from the cancellation of mortgage insurance. And each separate periodic payment or range disclosed in the table must be itemized as principal and interest. Oh my gosh, minimum and maximum payments must be determined using the minimum and maximum rates. Payments for mortgage insurance must be labeled mortgage insurance. Amounts paid into escrow must be labeled escrow. The total payment must be labeled total monthly payment. Subheadings must be used to indicate the number of years during which the payment or range of payments apply. And a final balloon payment must be labeled final payment. Taxes based on the improved property value, insurance, and other assessments must be labeled as such and expressed as a monthly amount with the statement that they may increase over time and that the consumer must pay separately any amounts not paid by the creditor. Estimated escrow payments for loans subject to RESPA must be disclosed using the escrow account analysis described in Reg X. Estimated escrow payments on non-RESPA transaction may be determined in the same manner as RESPA loans, and costs at closing table labeled closing costs. The total loan costs, including origination costs, costs the borrower shopped for, and costs the borrower did not shop for. The total of other costs, including taxes, insurance, prepaids, and escrow amounts, lender credits, and cash to close, including a statement that the total of the following amount includes the closing costs, the sum of closing costs, including costs paid before closing, and the closing costs that are financed, the down payment or funds from the borrower, the deposit, the funds to the borrower, the seller points, and any other adjustments. An alternative table, cash for closing for transactions without a seller, including the amount due to or from the consumer, and a statement stating whether the amount is due to or from the consumer, and a statement referring to the consumer to the cash to close table. An alternative calculation for cash to close transactions without a seller, and for transactions without a seller where the creditor used the alternative table, the creditor must disclose in the table titled Calculating Cash to Close the following. The statement: use this table to see what has changed from your loan estimate and the following: loan amount, the final amount, the loan amount estimate disclosed on the early disclosure, prominent disclosed question, did this change? If the amounts are different, a statement of the fact and a statement of whether the amount increased or decreased, or if the amounts are equal, a statement of the facts. The total closing costs titled Total Closing Costs, the amount of closing costs described on the early loan estimate, the final amount of borrower paid closing costs, the prominently disclosed statement, did this change? And if the amounts are different, a statement of that fact, and if the difference is attributable to differences in itemized charges, a statement that the consumer should see the total loan costs and the total of other costs disclosed to determine if the increase exceeds the limitations on increases in closing costs. 5. If there is an excess over the legal limitations on increases, a statement that the increase exceeds the legal limit by the dollar amount of the excess, and if any refund is provided, a statement directing the consumer to the required disclosure. If the amounts are equal, a statement of that fact. Moving on to page 320. Closing costs paid before closing, labeled closing costs paid before closing, must include under the heading loan estimate the amount of $0, under the heading final the amount designated as borrower paid before closing, and a prominent statement, did this change? If the final amount is different than $0, a statement of the fact, along with a statement that the consumer included the closing costs and the loan amount, which increased the loan amount, or if the amounts are equal, the statement of this fact. There's a couple more pieces that one would